navigating the sheer volume of information today, it feels less like a stream and more like a, well, fire hose, doesn't it?
It really does.
And now, with AI throwing even more content into the mix, figuring out what's real, what's relevant, what's just noise, it's a bigger challenge than ever for all of us.
That is, yeah. And that challenge is front and center for young people. They're growing up right in the middle of this landscape every single day.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we're tackling a fascinating report. It kind of pulls back the curtain on how young people, specifically ages 13 to 28, actually handle information, in practice.
How they search, how they decide what to trust.
Right, and how they process what they find, especially when it's for school or education.
This report, it's from Tänketanken Mandag Morgan and Tänketanken Fremtidens Biblioteker. What makes it so valuable, I think, is that it's not just surveys asking what young people think they do.
Ah, okay.
It's based on qualitative research. They did this mobile ethnographic study, basically followed them doing info tasks on their phones.
Wow, actually watching them.
Yeah, plus interviews, focus groups across different education levels. So it gives us a real look at their actual behavior, not just what they say they do.
That sounds incredibly useful. So our mission today is to unpack the key nuggets of knowledge, the surprising insights from this report, and pull out the most important takeaways for you, whether you're navigating this yourself or maybe thinking about how the next generation does it.
Sounds good. Let's jump right in. Maybe start with the very first step. How these young people go about searching for information.
Okay, let's unpack this. What did the study reveal about that initial approach, their searching?
Well, what's truly striking is their confidence level.
Yeah.
When it comes to finding info for school, anyway. On a scale of 1 to 10, they gave themselves an average score of 8.
An 8 out of 10. Wow, okay, that's pretty high self-assurance. Where does that come from? Is it justified?
Overwhelmingly, it seems to boil down to speed and ease.
Speed.
Yeah, they equate being good at finding information with being able to find it quickly. And, without much hassle. There's some great quotes in the report. A youth education student said, "Besides finding the information, I can do it quite quickly."
Right.
And someone in higher education rated themselves at a 9 because, quote, "I think I can quickly, easily, and effectively find the information that a project or assignment needs."
So speed equals effectiveness in their minds.
Pretty much. Even if it takes a little time, like one primary student said who gave a 7, the ability to find something fast seems to be the core metric.
Speed is the definition of success. Okay. And what's the tool enabling this speed? I mean, I think we can all guess this one.
If you guess Google, you're spot on.
It.
Out of 26 participants asked about their top 3 sources, 22 included online search engines. And Google was the one they named specifically.
Why Google? What's the magic there for them?
It's that speed and ease again, right? Plus accessibility. It's always right at hand on their phones.
Makes sense.
Perfect for just getting a quick fact, defining a term. The report gives examples like needing a speech for Danish class, finding rock types for geography.
Just quick hits of info.
Exactly. Or researching EU Fit for 55 initiatives. Google is the immediate go-to for that initial question.
But they do use other sources too, right? I saw mentions of digital learning platforms, teachers, parents, friends, even textbooks.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But these other sources seem to appeal less for raw speed and more for perceived credibility or convenience in different ways.
How so?
Well, digital learning platforms, think Clio or Systime, especially if a teacher recommends them, they're seen as highly reliable, credible.
Okay, teacher approved.
And people, teachers, parents, friends, they're easy to ask for quick questions. There's that personal trust element mixed with convenience.
And textbooks? I mean, they seem like the opposite of Google speed.
They are. Textbooks are viewed as very reliable, great for background knowledge, maybe for a big BA project or something.
Right, deep dives.
Yeah, but definitely seen as more time-consuming than just hopping online. So you see this constant trade-off playing out.
Yeah.
The lightning speed of Google versus the sort of trusted authority of these other sources.
That makes sense. Now, what about AI? Tools like ChatGPT, where do they fit into this searching picture?
Interestingly, not so much for the initial search, especially among the younger students. Primary, lower secondary, upper secondary.
Really? Why the hesitation? I thought they'd be all over it.
Well, a big factor seems to be the attitude in schools. Teachers, institutions. They're often wary. One student actually said their school doesn't normalize using AI. Teachers might call it unreliable.
So if the school isn't on board...
Exactly. Without clear guidance or acceptance, they're hesitant to make it a core part of their search process. There's also this thing, the report called the mental blacklist that some students seem to keep.
A blacklist. Okay, what kind of sources end up on that?
Open forums,
Yeah.
places where anyone can edit. Think Wikipedia, Reddit, Twitter.
Ah, okay. Makes sense.
Some young people actively avoid these because they just feel it's too hard to figure out if they're trustworthy.
Huh.
One student put it pretty clearly. An open forum like Wikipedia I would not use because it is very difficult to be source critical of it, as all people can write on them.
Fair enough. So they have their favorites, their blacklist, some hesitation around AI. But okay, if you ask them in an ideal world, how should you search for information for an assignment? Can they actually describe a structured strategy?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. When they were asked how they'd ideally approach an assignment, say on climate change, they could articulate a pretty solid four-phase process.
4 phases. Okay, what are they?
First, delimiting the topic, then searching, then source criticism,
Yeah.
and finally, quality assurance.
Right. Break that down. Phase 1, delimitation.
Basically narrowing the focus. They get that climate change is way too broad.
Smart.
Yeah, a primary school student even explained they'd find a subtopic first, like inland ice melting. They recognize this makes the actual searching much easier later on.
Okay, good thinking. And searching, phase 2. What does that look like ideally?
Starting with Google, usually, but using those narrowed down keywords, or asking specific questions like, what are the causes of temperature increases, or what consequences does climate change have? Much more targeted.
Got it. How do they supplement that initial Google search in their ideal plan?
This is interesting. It kind of varies by education level.
Oh, how?
Younger students often mentioned leaning on those digital learning platforms like Alinea or Gildendal,
The teacher-approved ones again?
right? Upper secondary students, they seem more drawn to visual sources,
Hmm.
images, videos, even quotes from public figures like Greta Thunberg, which, might reflect their social media habits.
Interesting connection.
Yeah.
And higher education.
They turn more towards academic databases,
Huh.
AU Library, Google Scholar, and they often search in English to get a broader range of results. So the stage of education really shapes where they look beyond Google.
Okay, makes sense. Phase 3 was source criticism. What do they say they'd do there?
Well, they talk about checking the sender's credibility, asking, who's behind this? Is it an expert, someone who's really researched the topic?
Checking the source. Standard stuff.
Yeah, and looking out for promotional content, obvious bias, checking if something's marked promoted, things like that.
And the last phase, quality assurance.
That involves double-checking facts against multiple sources,
Mm-hmm.
or just making sure the information they found actually answers the assignment question. Like one student talked about verifying that info on melting icebergs was actually relevant to the specific task they were given.
Okay, so they can describe a really thoughtful, multi-step process. Delimitation, targeted searching, checking credibility, checking relevance. But here comes the but, right? This is where the study found that disconnect.
Exactly. This is where the rubber meets the road. Despite being able to lay out these nice strategies, when the researchers actually watched them tackle a concrete task, like finding info on climate change in Denmark, many of just didn't follow their own plan.
They skip steps. Which ones?
Often, yeah. That first step, delimitation, frequently skipped.
Really?
They just jump straight into Google with really broad search terms, like literally klimaforandringer in Denmark, climate change in Denmark.
So the need for speed just took over.
It looks like it. The impulse was just to search something quickly.
And what happened then? What was the outcome of that broad, quick search approach?
Well, they did find information. But instead of that planned search and critical evaluation they described, they often just clicked the top, say 1 to 3 results on Google, like ecolariat.dk or climatilpasning.dk.
Because they came up first.
Because they came up first and looked sort of relevant. The drive for speed meant they often bypassed that more critical evaluation of other links further down the page, the stuff they mentioned in their ideal strategy.
Okay, so let's sum up part 1 on searching. Young people feel confident because they're fast, heavily reliant on Google. They know a strategic approach, delimitation, source criticism, etc. But when they actually do a task, that need for speed often wins. They default to broad searches and clicking the first few results.
Precisely. It really highlights this gap, doesn't it, between knowing the right way and actually doing it, especially when time feels like a factor.
Yeah, that theory versus practice gap. Okay, that leads us perfectly into the next big area, evaluation. If they're prioritizing speed in searching, how skilled or confident are they in judging the quality and trustworthiness of the information they find so quickly?
Well, they are slightly less competent here than with searching,
Hmm.
and still rate themselves reasonably high. The average score for evaluating trustworthiness was 7.4 out of 10.
Still pretty high. 7.4. Where does that confidence come from?
A lot of them mentioned learning source criticism in school, or they talked about their own habit of cross-checking information.
So they feel equipped?
Some do. One student felt school taught them enough to know if the information I find is true or false. Another in higher ed said they almost always double-check to be sure that several sources say the same thing.
Hmm.
But, and this is crucial, they also recognize this is an area where they need to improve. They're aware of weaknesses.
Ah, okay. So they know it's not perfect. What weaknesses do they see?
It varies a bit by age. Younger students often feel they just lack the skills, or they don't prioritize the time for it. Some even express this idea that the skills will just develop naturally, like, I think I should get a bit older.
Huh. If only it were that easy.
Right. Upper secondary students find it explicitly difficult to learn. They mentioned AI and chatbots making things harder, and they particularly struggle with identifying author bias. One student said technology makes it even harder to find reliable sources.
That's a real challenge. And higher education.
For them, the challenge shifts more towards evaluating complex academic articles, trying to figure out which scientific papers are actually reliable.
It's fascinating, though. Across all the age groups, there's this underlying theme. Knowing what to trust is hard, even if the type of source gets more complex.
Absolutely. It really suggests the need for ongoing developing instruction throughout their education, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Not just a one-off lesson in middle school.
Definitely. Okay, so let's look at evaluation in practice again. Back to that climate change task.
Yeah.
Did they actually apply the critical checks they talked about? Checking senders, comparing sources?
What did the researchers see?
Well, some strengths were definitely visible. You had students really doing it.
Like what?
One student in higher education systematically compared specific data points, like temperature increase predictions, across different sources to see if they matched up.
Okay, that's good practice.
Others actively checked the senders, verifying if a source was from a municipality or a government agency like the Environmental Protection Agency. One upper secondary student specifically checked if a climate adaptation website was linked to those official agencies to gauge its trustworthiness.
So some are doing the legwork.
Yeah.
But I sense another but coming. Did that speed-first approach we saw in searching affect evaluation too?
It did, yeah. For many students, they did not actively fact-check or really investigate the source, much beyond how it looked on the Google results page.
So same pattern. It seems like it. That speed priority often meant just accepting the information found quickly, without the deeper critical look they know they could take. Now, the report also looked specifically at evaluating visual information, which is so important now, right?
Totally. Images, videos, everywhere.
They showed them a fake AI-generated image of Donald Trump and a real one of the Danish royal family. How do they do with that?
Were they good at spotting the fake?
Mostly, yeah. Most of the young people successfully identified the AI-manipulated Trump image as fake.
Okay. What strategies did they use for images? Was it different from text?
Yes, quite different. They used a mix of interesting approaches. One was what the report called a logical argument.
Logical argument.
Just assessing if the situation pictured made sense. They doubted Trump would really be holding a police baton in that specific context. It just seemed off.
Okay, common sense check.
Right. Whereas a formal photo of the royal family seemed realistic, plausible. They asked things like, why does he have a police baton? That kind of logical questioning. Another approach was a societal media debate argument.
Meaning?
Comparing the image to what they already knew from the news or social media. If it was a big event, they'd expect to have seen it reported. If they hadn't, they got suspicious.
Using their background knowledge.
Exactly. Or if it looked like a type of photo they had seen before, like a series of official royal photos, they were more likely to think it was real. They'd say things like, it would be in the news if it had happened, or mention seeing a photo series on Instagram.
Okay, so logic, background knowledge. Did they use any specific technical knowledge about AI itself?
Yes, and this is where it gets really interesting. Some did. They applied an AI knowledge argument.
Like knowing AI's tells.
Precisely. Drawing on awareness of AI's current limitations, like its known difficulty rendering realistic hands.
Yeah, hands, yes.
One student specifically pointed out a police officer's hand in that fake Trump image looked weird, like it was missing a finger.
Wow.
That specific technical insight helped them spot the manipulation. It shows a different kind of critical thinking emerging, specifically tuned to AI fakes.
That is fascinating. A new layer of digital literacy. Okay, what about evaluating text? specifically AI-generated text. The report had a task with an AI text about Mette Frederiksen, the Danish prime minister, and this text had both factual errors and subjective biased phrasing.
Right. And this task revealed something really crucial.
What was that?
Young people are significantly better at spotting the subjective language and bias than they are at spotting the straight-up factual errors.
Huh. So they can tell if it sounds biased, but not necessarily if it's just plain wrong.
Pretty much, yeah. Phrases like remarkable political career or her sharp intellect, those jumped out at them immediately.
Red flags for bias.
Exactly. They flagged those as biased and reasons they wouldn't trust or use the text. They made comments like, it seems too subjective, or it's written to highlight how good and cool Met is. Very subjective. They nailed the bias detection.
But the
The
facts.
factual errors, they're like incorrect details about when she was justice minister or her specific bachelor's degree, largely missed by most of them. And interestingly, some even incorrectly doubted the correct fact mentioned that she has a master's in African studies. They just relied on a feeling it was wrong, rather than checking. One quote was like, I doubt that she has a master's in African studies. Can you even have a master's in African studies?
So gut feeling over verification sometimes,
Unless they made a specific effort. The few students who did catch the factual errors, they did so because they actively went and fact-checked. They looked it up on reliable sources, like the Danish Parliament's website, ft.dk.
So fact-checking isn't the default. It's an extra step they have to consciously choose to take.
It seems that way. Their bias detector is maybe more automatic, but the fact-checking muscle needs deliberate exercise.
Okay, let's sum up evaluation then. They feel moderately confident, but know they need to improve, citing challenges with AI, complexity. In practice, speed often trumps deep critical checks. They're better at spotting bias than factual errors in text. And for images, they use a mix of logic, prior knowledge, and some emerging AI-specific awareness.
Right. Their evaluation skills are definitely developing, but there are clear areas needing more focus, especially that rigorous factual verification piece.
Definitely. Okay, let's move on to the next stage. Processing. Once they found information, how do they actually pull out the key knowledge? How do they, digest it?
The primary method the researchers observed was a really strong reliance on the visual structure of the text itself.
Visual structure. You mean like headlines and subheadings?
Absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
Headlines, subheadings, those are their main guides to figuring out what's important in a text.
Why? How does that work?
Well, as one student put it, they look at headlines because that is what the journalist thinks are the most important points. They basically trust the author or editor structure to signal the key information for them.
Using the text's own signposts.
Okay.
Did the report give examples of this in action, like with that DR article or the Climate Council report task?
It did. And it's pretty clear. For the DR article task, the key points students pulled out closely mirrored the article's main headline and its subheadings. They focused on political disagreement, agriculture's role, balancing solutions, and consequences. Basically, the topics highlighted by the structure. And with the Climate Council report, it had these really clear sections: 2025 goal, 2030 goal, EU obligations. Students often structure their own notes and summaries based on those exact headings.
Wow.
The report even showed an example where one student used abbreviations of the headings in their notes. They were really keying off that structure.
So they're using the text's roadmap to find the highlights. That sounds efficient, I guess, for identifying points quickly. But are there any downsides, any potential drawbacks to relying so heavily on structure?
Yeah, there's a potential pitfall mentioned. Because they stick so closely to the original text's structure, and maybe even its phrasing,
I see where this is going.
their resulting summaries or notes can sometimes end up being very similar, or even, quote, nearly identical to the source material.
So it borders on copying, or at least lacks independent synthesis.
Right. It suggests that while this method is efficient for finding key points, it might lead to processing that's less about deep understanding and putting things in their own words, and more about just extracting or reproducing the source's structure and wording.
Okay, so for processing, they efficiently identify key info by using headlines and subheadings as their main guide. But this strong reliance might sometimes result in summaries that stay too close to the original text, potentially hindering deeper synthesis.
Exactly. It's a practical shortcut to grab main points fast, but maybe not always the best for deep learning and original formulation.
Got it. Okay, we've seen how they search, evaluate, and process. Now let's shift to their own perspective. What do young people themselves feel they need to improve? And crucially, what would actually make learning about these skills, well, less boring? Because that came up, didn't it?
Oh, it definitely did. That's maybe the first key finding here. Learning about information competencies, information skills, it's widely seen as boring.
Oh dear, that's not great news, is it? The essential skill set for navigating the modern world, and it's a hard sell.
It seems that way. The report shared this anecdote about students ranking potential course titles, not based on what sounded interesting, but on what sounded least boring.
Ouch, least boring. That really says something.
It really does. Underscores a lack of intrinsic motivation for the topic itself.
Okay, but despite finding the topic boring, do they recognize specific skills within it that they do want to get better at?
Yes, absolutely. Two areas came up pretty consistently across all the educational levels.
What were they?
First, getting faster and more precise in searching. And second, improving their ability to evaluate trustworthiness.
Wait, they want to be faster searchers, even though they already rate themselves highly on speed.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? There's a recognition that even their current speed could be improved, made more efficient. And how they talk about it evolves.
How so?
Younger students just want to quickly find the good sources. Simple as that. Upper secondary students get more specifically. They want to choose the right search terms to get there faster,
Or strategic.
right? And higher education students, they're aiming for concrete search techniques for even greater efficiency, especially with complex searches. So the desire for optimized speed is definitely there.
Okay. And the other big one, evaluating trustworthiness.
Also a shared need, but again, with increasing sophistication. Younger students just want to know what I can trust.
Basic reliability.
Yeah. Upper secondary students want to dig deeper, understand author bias, learn when alarm bells should ring.
More nuanced understanding.
And higher education students, they need concrete methods for tackling those complex academic sources we talked about. So the core need, figuring out what's reliable, is constant, but the context and the required techniques definitely change.
That makes a lot of sense. Did they specifically mention wanting to learn about AI in this context?
Yes, particularly the upper secondary and higher education students. They explicitly wanted to learn more about AI tools and, crucially, how to use them effectively.
Why the interest there? What were the drivers?
Seems like two main things. One is definitely efficiency, wanting to get through a whole lot instead of reading enormously. Seeing AI as a potential tool for faster processing or summarizing.
Using it as a tool.
Right. But the other driver is a mix of complexity and maybe a bit of wariness. As one higher education student put it, they want to learn how to outsmart the robot.
Outsmart the robot. Love that.
Yeah. It shows they recognize AI can be convincing, maybe even tricky, and they fear being misled by it. They want to understand it better to navigate it safely. So given this perception of the overall topic as, well, boring, what do they say would actually make learning about it more interesting? How do you engage this tough crowd?
Yeah, what's the hook?
Well, for the younger students, primary, lower secondary, upper secondary, the fictional course title that appealed most was the one mentioning AI. How can AI be a useful tool?
Ah, the relevance factor.
Exactly. It wasn't necessarily that AI itself sounded thrilling, but it felt new and directly relevant to their lives, and especially their schoolwork. As one student said, AI is so new, and we know little about it. And it says that it's something you can use in school, so it also makes it seem more relevant for us.
So tie it to something current and practical.
Seems like it. Because the other titles, they were ranked based on being least boring. And a title like Information Seeking in a Digital Age that was seen as particularly old and uninteresting by these younger groups.
Digital age already sounds dated to teenagers. Wow.
Tells you something, doesn't it? Interestingly, though, higher education students had a more varied response, and some of them actually saw information seeking in a digital age more positively. They described it as simple, relevant.
So maybe the framing needs to adapt to the age group, too.
Definitely. So the big takeaway here for anyone thinking about teaching these skills,
What's the bottom line?
young people do recognize the need to improve in specific areas: speed, trustworthiness, AI understanding. But the underlying topic itself isn't grabbing them. So how it's framed and presented is absolutely critical. They need to see the practical necessity, the direct relevance to their own goals and challenges to actually get engaged.
Makes perfect sense. You have to connect it to their world. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at how young people search, how they evaluate, how they process information, and importantly, what they think they need to get better at. Let's try and connect the dots now and think about the relevance of all this for you listening in.
Yeah, let's summarize the journey. We've seen that confidence in searching, mostly tied to speed and heavily reliant on Google.
Right, but also that gap between the strategy they know and the quicker, broader approach they often use in practice.
Then we got into evaluation. Moderately confident, but aware of weaknesses. Better, interestingly, at spotting bias and subjective language in text than factual errors.
And using different strategies for images logic, background knowledge, and that fascinating emerging awareness of AI tells, like the weird hands.
Exactly. And we explored their processing method, really leaning on headlines and subheadings. Efficient for pulling out points, but maybe risks staying too close to the original source text, bordering on plagiarism sometimes.
And finally, we heard directly from them. They know they need to improve efficiency, critical evaluation, understanding AI, but the topic itself needs that relevant framing to overcome the boring factor. And really, these aren't just findings about students, are they? They highlight challenges that feel pretty universal in today's information world.
Absolutely.
I mean, you face information overload, you feel the temptation to just grab the quickest answer. You
Yeah.
have that constant need to verify what you see and read, especially now with AI generating convincing content.
And that task of pulling out key insights efficiently from just vast amounts of data,
Mm.
that's something everyone grapples with.
Yeah. Understanding these patterns, these challenges, not just in the next generation, but maybe reflecting on them in ourselves feels absolutely critical. Strong information competencies are foundational for learning, for work.
For just being an informed citizen, really,
Yeah.
in a society where information flies around instantly and isn't always checked or reliable.
Absolutely. Okay, so here's maybe a thought to leave you with after this deep dive, something to mull over.
Okay.
In a world where AI can generate incredibly convincing text, images, video instantly, and information is available at lightning speed but requires constant vigilance, how do you consciously balance that need for efficiency, for speed, and finding information with the equally critical need for thorough verification and critical evaluation? What specific strategies do you rely on day to day? And maybe ask yourself,
Mhm.
how confident are you that those strategies are truly sufficient for the information environment we're all living